Thank you, everybody, for coming here tonight. This is the annual library lecture series sponsored by the Degrowth Institute of Philosophy. We do this every year in October. I have a lecture here down at Central Library in the evenings of each Thursday of the month. So this year's theme, as you know, is climate change and social justice. And we're very lucky to have with us our very own Bipasha Baruah, who is a professor at Western and is an internationally recognized scholar at the intersection of the economy, climate, and gender equality and social justice. Bipasha will speak for 45 minutes, about an hour. There'll be time after for questions. I'll describe how that's going to work when we get to that point. Meanwhile, please join me in thanking Bipasha for being here tonight.
All right, I'm a professor. I'll start with a lot of acknowledgements. I'm not exactly certain what the public library is located on, but Western University is situated on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and Ottawa people who have long-standing relationships with Southwestern Ontario and the City of London. Within proximity to Western, there are 3 First Nations communities: the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. In the wider region of Southwestern Ontario, there are 9 First Nations and a growing Indigenous urban population. Western recognizes the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and all 11 of the original peoples of Turtle Island or North America to the development of Canada. So thank you to the Rotman Center for inviting me to give this talk, and to all of you for attending on the Thursday before Thanksgiving, no less. I'm sure you're all familiar with the quote by Zora Neale Hurston that research is formalized curiosity. It's poking and prying with a purpose. So I'm an applied social scientist, and I've been poking and prying with a purpose for more than 20 years at this point. My training is really interdisciplinary. It's like I couldn't decide what I wanted to be when I grew up, so I did natural sciences and then I did social sciences. So it includes both the natural and social sciences, and it includes fields as diverse as environmental science, gender studies, international development, journalism, and feminist economics. So broadly speaking, I try to use my training to understand social, economic, and environmental problems that lack simple solutions or straightforward policy fixes. But regardless of what specific project I work on, the big question that all my research, in one way or another, aims to answer is how can we build economic systems that recognize and work within the biophysical limits of our planet, while simultaneously reducing social inequality, social and economic inequality. So addressing this trilemma, as I like to call it, is broadly where all my research is located. And I currently have 2 major research projects. One tries to understand how to ensure that what is being called the green transition, meaning the transition out of fossil fuels, will be more gender equitable and more socially just than its fossil fuel-based predecessor. The other project tries to understand how we might address gender equality and social justice if we were to shrink rather than grow our economies. So the 2 are obviously related. The first looks at social equity within the context of technological changes, such as the transition to renewable energy, green construction, manufacturing, and low carbon transportation. The second looks at social equity issues within a framework of intentionally shrinking economies, planned contraction or degrowth, rather than technological fixes such as green energy. And although my research on access and employment in the just transition is actually much better developed, and I think I'm better known for that, today I thought I would mix it up and talk about the other piece, talk about my research on degrowth. The ideas that are congruent with degrowth have existed for a very long time in different religious and cultural contexts. In the West, though, broadly speaking, it gained prominence and visibility when the Club of Rome published its famous 1972 report called The Limits to Growth, which is still one of the most controversial but best-selling environmental books of all time. The study argued that exploding global population and resource use would exceed the Earth's carrying capacity within one generation and result in a precipitous decline in welfare. Of course, some of the projections based on Malthusian ideas about extreme population growth have been called out, they've been debunked, and they're called out basically for stoking the West's racist fears of population growth in the global South. From an ecological perspective, though, the 1972 study actually got more right than wrong. We now know that we've exceeded 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries that define a habitable planet. Now, the concept of degrowth or planned economic contraction has received significant attention, mostly within European countries, especially because the first conference was held, the International Conference on Degrowth was held in Paris in 2008. And central to the degrowth philosophy is imagining and enacting alternative visions to modern growth-based development. So within the degrowth literature, new ways of working and new forms of employment, such as part-time work, work time reduction, remote work, flexible work, job sharing, alongside interventions such as universal basic income, universal social protection, free post-secondary education, maximum salary caps, reform of financial institutions, debt forgiveness for highly indebted poor countries have been proposed as ways by which industrialized countries might balance economic security with environmental protection. Now, within the degrowth literature, the fact that the current economic paradigm, our current economic growth paradigm perpetuates existing gender and environmental justices is very well established. We don't need to argue about that. But an evolving body of scientific evidence has also emerged in the past 10 to 15 years, and it almost unanimously endorses the role that degrowth in industrialized countries can play in balancing global economic needs with environmental concerns, thereby enabling humans to live within the Earth's carrying capacity. So the link between degrowth and environmental sustainability is much more straightforward, since we know that decreasing production and consumption, as evidenced, if you remember, by the industrial and air travel shutdowns in the beginning of COVID in the first part of 2020, directly alleviates environmental pressure. I think we all remember during the first 3 months, you remember these images? We can see the Eiffel Tower. People can see the Taj Mahal. They can see, ozone over the Arctic. So I think we all remember seeing images and headlines like this. That was actually very, very, I thought it was amazing. It was from Wuhan, showing, just a year apart, basically, those images. And headlines like people in India can see the Himalayas for the first time in decades as the lockdown eases their pollution. Scientists say that the COVID-19 pandemic slowed the melting of Himalayan glaciers. So within the degrowth literature, the link between degrowth and environmental sustainability, like I said, is very clear and has been established really well. But the link between degrowth and gender equality and social justice, there's really no consensus on it. Some researchers have suggested that degrowth may emancipate, groups that are disadvantaged within the capitalist system, and the limitations that are imposed by the current economic model, and it might generate new forms of access, participation, and representation. Others have suggested that current forms of gender and other social inequalities within the capitalist system may be exacerbated under degrowth and lead to further, marginalization, unless appropriate social reforms and public policies are implemented simultaneously. Now, of course, we know that feminist scholars have long emphasized that economic growth as measured by GDP, for example, or just the production of goods, fails to factor in environmental harms as well as the costs of social reproduction. I think the best known work going back to the 1980s was Marilyn Loring. I think it was called If Women Counted from 1989, if I remember correctly. So several scholars who had more recently asked more concrete questions about the social equity and justice dimensions of degrowth. For example, as a follow-up to a degrowth proposal in Europe for a 20-hour work week, scholars have asked that if middle-class professionals are able to reduce their childcare needs while working less, what would happen to the livelihoods of those whose economic mainstay is caring for the children of others? Similarly, if hotels start, as many already have, reducing their ecological footprint and cutting maintenance costs, obviously, by offering guests incentives to forego daily housekeeping and laundry services, would the jobs held by the cleaning staff, among whom women, immigrants, racialized minorities, and often documented and undocumented migrants, would they not be rendered even more precarious and poorly paid than they already are? I think most of you remember this, right? It began in COVID. When you stay in a hotel, they wouldn't do any housekeeping for you, or they would say, we do it every other day. But now they've continued it, and many hotel chains I notice are doing that, where I remember the IHG chain, some hotels will actually give you, when you leave, if you forego housekeeping every day, they give you something like a Starbucks $10 gift card that you don't need, but they give you that. And I was thinking, okay, so here we are, they're saving, obviously they're saying it, the narrative is that it's for the environment. We know that it's done to cut maintenance costs as well, but the benefits are accruing to the guest and to the hotel industry. But what about the people who work there, right? So we can see these things. I started playing with these ideas for a while and thinking, if our economies were to contract, what types of policies and programs might we implement to reduce social inequality? So these are the types of questions that we hope to find evidence for in this research. So what did we try to do? To review the existing literature and evidence published between year 2000 and 2024, so it's obviously ongoing, on degrowth, gender equality, and social equity, to identify potential impacts that degrowth in industrialized countries may have on gender equality and social equity, and finally to selectively identify promising programs, policies, and practices from OECD countries and beyond. We looked at developing countries, we looked at emerging economies for reconciling degrowth with gender equality and social justice. Now, I've been playing with these ideas for a long time, and it was in, I think, towards the second half of 2019, or at the very beginning of 2020, SHIRT issued this call, and it was called Living Within Years Carrying Capacity, right? And I saw it and thought, well, there's a chance for me to, actually do some research on this topic. And it was a knowledge synthesis grant, meaning that you didn't have to do primary, any kind of empirical work. So I put in the application, and we literally got the news that it had been successful on the day we went into the full lockdown. If you remember, that was March 20th of 2020, and Western News even did a cheesy story that kind of made me sound like a clairvoyant. It said pandemic turns research scenario into unexpected reality, which I thought was quite amusing. So anyway, so the global economy shrank dramatically soon after. We remember this, right? In effect, offering opportunities to study degrowth and its implications for gender equality in real time. Now, it's very important to clarify that what we planned to study was the relationship between, I'll mention that, I'll come to that, was the relationship between planned deliberate degrowth, gender equality, and social justice, not unplanned economic contraction triggered by a pandemic. So degrowth proponents envision the economies of industrialized countries shrinking by design, not because of disease or disaster. Nevertheless, it was impossible not to notice that interventions that were endorsed by degrowth proponents, basic income support, reduced working hours, flexible work, and remote work, for example, were rolled out in industrialized, emerging, and developing economies around the world within weeks of COVID being declared a pandemic. And all of a sudden, terms like mutual aid, pandemic solidarity, frugal abundance were becoming part of mainstream journalistic discourse. I'm not sure you can see it from there. So basically, these are headlines from 2020 to 2023. They're all and the thing is, these are not particularly progressive, like venues, Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Economist, World Economic Forum, which now has its own, a whole session devoted to degrowth during its forums. So they were all saying, we need to have a genuine discussion about this, nobody was saying this is a terrible idea. It was like, we need to talk about this, with the possible obvious exception of Fox News, who said, is this the greatest flop in American history? Not said, I think. So in Canada, when we looked at all of this, at the time, we realized we could find 4 very distinct themes in looking at Canada, right? One was the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which I think people remember, and the idea of the universal basic income. Then what is essential work and who carries it out? New ways of working and new forms of employment. And finally, the care sector and the care economy. Talk about each one. So in Canada, the SERB, if you remember the acronym, we've forgotten, I think, in a few years. Although it was introduced as a temporary income support program, has reinvigorated an existing debate about a guaranteed basic income. In May 2020, so just 2 months after we went into pandemic mode, 50 senators sent a letter to Justin Trudeau calling for the SERB to evolve into a minimum basic income program. And news stories and op-eds that spanned the ideological spectrum started appearing in the media over the past, soon after. And this included, and it was, although SERB was never unanimously endorsed, obviously, even very conservative think tanks, like if you think about the C.D. Howe Institute, Fraser Institute, and newspapers like the Financial Post, had emphasized the need for a genuine public discussion about replacing existing provincial and federal income support and related programs with one program that reduces administrative costs, better coordinates assistance, and increases resources available to Canadians. So the deployment of SERB, albeit as a temporary income support program, also led to a much broader conversation about the possibilities and benefits of providing social protection within a human rights framework and delinking social security from employment status. And honestly, even before COVID, there have been significant advancements globally in expanding and strengthening social protection policies. So as more countries are transitioning towards developing welfare systems, and these are not just European or North American countries, we're seeing African countries, Asian countries, and Latin American countries, either including, introducing basic income schemes or things like conditional and unconditional cash transfers that enable low-income families to make, priority decisions for themselves and their families. So programs like Bolsa Familia in Brazil, which even Jair Bolsonaro didn't dare touch during the time that he was president, because it was so popular and so well established by then. Mexico's Prospera program, Mali's social cash transfer initiative, India's basic income pilot, and the most well-known one of those it's a program called in Togo, obviously small country, 8 million people. I think per capita GDP is less than $700. I'm fairly certain of that. And it was a program that reached large numbers of very precariously employed and informal sector workers. And how they did that was they used machine learning, they looked at national consumption data, and then they used mobile telephones to basically transfer money to people. It was extraordinarily successful, and if you want to read about it, there's a lot. They're very good evaluations. The World Bank did one, and it was really amazing. And so they were very clever about it. They know today that we live in a world today where the poorest people are more likely to have a cell phone than a toilet. That's the world today, right? So really, tapped into that. And we know that in that sense, African countries, Asian countries are really, really ahead of the curve in terms of technology. So these days when I travel, I'll be in Kenya, I remember last year, I'm thinking, I'm like a dinosaur walking around paying cash, because nobody uses cash, they use M-Pesa, right? Similarly today in India, in rural India, you can transfer money for a piece of fruit on your phone. And again, people look at me like, what is that? Do you have money? Actually money? And I'm counting my dirty bills, to hand out. So they picked up very well on that. And I think these are very hopeful developments, given that structural inequality constrains individual ability to exercise rights and to demand entitlement. And globally, we know that 92% of people and 87% of men 92% of women and 87% of men work in the informal sector. So almost 1.6 billion informal sector workers were affected by the lockdowns and other, COVID-induced containment measures. But when we look to see how many countries have done actually some kind of cash transfer program for informal sector workers, out of 190 countries for which we were able to find some data, only 30 had some kind of income support in place for informal sector workers, and the best known one was definitely the BC. Now we have to remember that very large numbers of Canadians whether they're gig and contract workers, migrant workers, informal sector workers such as babysitters, house sitters, sex workers. We don't think of the informal sector in Canada. Of course it exists, right? They didn't benefit from any at all from income replacement measures such as CERB. And this point was very well made by Andrea Burke, who was my PhD student and a research assistant on the project, and in policy options, no less. So well done, Andrea. So alongside the coverage about CERB and the possibilities of universal basic income, COVID led to an unprecedented, I would say, reckoning of what exactly constitutes essential work and essential service in Canada, and how unevenly that burden of essential work and caregiving had been shouldered during the pandemic, notably by women and by communities of color. So one of the first things I think is that if you remember this very clearly, that there were like calls for comprehensive reforms of sectors such as long-term care, home care, and childcare, as well as the need not just for higher wages, but higher social, like stronger social societal valorization. The respect counts as well. So things like more secure employment, paid sick leave, affordable childcare, housing, student debt assistance, and other stronger social protections for those who work in these sectors. So the lessons learned and the evidence generated from the COVID-19 pandemic do have the potential to inform responsive social and economic policies that could benefit large groups of essential workers who are presently very underpaid and often very precariously employed. And I include personal support workers, health aides, sanitation workers, grocery clerks, meat packers, and of course, again, women, immigrants, racialized minorities, documented and undocumented migrants are often very overrepresented in these groups. Gender played a very important role in determining how the costs and burdens of essential work have been borne. Globally, men are more likely to die of COVID, while women are much more likely to lose employment. That was basically the norm. Women are more likely to work in industries the hardest hit by COVID, so hospitality, retail, tourism, health, social services, for example. And these industries are also far less well suited for doing physical distancing and remote work. This also explains why sectors like construction, manufacturing, and transportation, which tend to employ larger numbers of men and include jobs that are much more easily adapted for physical distancing, why they recovered much earlier than sectors in which women are likely to be employed. Women in Canada are also twice as likely as men to work part-time. It's been fairly stable. It's 13% and 26% for women, that figure. And when employers have to resort to cost-cutting measures, part-time workers are often, obviously, the first to be let go. And the high proportion of women also working in small-sized firms during that time, in service industries particularly, combined with the greater employment losses among small firms in the service industries, exacerbated this gender difference in loss of employment. I'm sure we all remember. I tried to keep several, I was thinking like, I have to order from these small restaurants all the time, just trying to keep them open, literally, right? And we know that many closed and never quite recovered. So the confluence of all of these factors resulted in much higher levels of employment loss for women, to the point that they were calling it the she session in some journalistic, some articles. Another reason why women had fared much worse than men during the pandemic is that much more men tend to be employed in higher numbers than women in professional, scientific, and technical fields, or say STEM, architecture, actuarial sciences, logistics, things like that, which tend to be easier to carry out remotely or with physical distancing. Ability to work remotely correlates with other entrenched social hierarchies based on race and ethnicity. I don't think anybody would be surprised by that. So there was one author who described it as the gender of COVID intersects predictably with the color of COVID, to result in women and people of color making up most essential workers and the unemployed during this time, which is two very straightforward stats. I mean, these are actually American stats, but as you can see, who can work remotely, very clear. 37% for Asian Americans, 30% white Americans, Black Americans 20%, and 16% for Hispanic Americans. So we see very clearly the figures. And then who can work remotely based on education? If you have a graduate degree, 50% of people, and if you have high school, only about 10%. So we now have what I would consider a two-tier economy in Canada of non-essential workers, and definitely one, who can work from home, and essential workers not just healthcare workers and first responders. Also think of childcare workers, long-term care workers, gender-based violence service providers was an epidemic literally during COVID. Cashiers, cleaners, grocery clerks, delivery workers, bus drivers, mail carriers, and warehouse workers. Again, groups within which women and racialized minorities are the majority. For trans and other gender diverse populations, existing experiences of employment, health, and social service discrimination and stigma were compounded by the pandemic. Think of something as simple, a very simple activity as hand washing, which was endorsed very widely as a sanitation strategy during a pandemic. It posed a much bigger challenge for transgender than a cisgender person, especially in public settings, because public restrooms and change rooms in Canada remain overwhelmingly marked as single gender spaces in which non-binary and trans people regularly experience harassment and intimidation. Moving on to the next point about new ways of working and new forms of employment, the unprecedented global expansion of remote and flexible work brought about by COVID in 2020 may also lead to longer-term changes in ways of working in many sectors of employment with very important consequences for gender equality. Now, countries with more equitable gender norms tend to have a better established tradition of flex work, of flex time policies, right? So as an example, Finland offers the most flexible working schedules on the planet, with 92% of employers allowing workers to adapt at least half their hours. Compared to, if you think like Japan on the lower end at 18%. And in fact, Finland now has a Working Hours Act, which came into effect in 2020, which was quite interesting. It's even higher now than 92%. So that's the level of flexibility. But remember, it's just, even if this were true, even if it were true that more countries, even if more countries started introducing flexible work policies, we'd still be left with the much more significant challenge of changing the perception of caregiving as a gendered responsibility carried out solely or mostly by women. So until more transformative social change takes place in gender relations, flexible working schedules may actually reinforce existing gender balances in employment and care. So for flexible work and remote work to become a policy prescription that advances gender equality, some structural changes to employment norms and gender norms are necessary. Strengthening long-term investment in the care sector, which includes care of seniors, children, and adults with special needs, is essential to enable workers to benefit optimally from the availability of remote and flexible work options. If you remember during COVID, there were, to the point where Andrea and I were like, we're going to see one more image of a woman holding a baby and working very happily at her laptop. So these were the images, and they were being used. The ironic thing is that they were being used even to talk about the issues of gender inequality. So they were doing this, and they're like normalizing and almost entrenching the gender division of labor. I mean, who can work like this? And I remember there was one where it was like, there was an elderly person in the corner, and there was this woman with the two children. Like, she's intergenerational caregiving, production and reproduction, all in the same frame. I mean, come on, right? Like, so it's being presented as this policy for gender equality. We need a lot of other things to happen before it becomes, before it actually, improves certain norms. Also, single parents faced unprecedented challenges during the pandemic. Balancing caregiving and work is the norm for single parents. Not even, doesn't have to be a pandemic. At normal times, they bear a very heavy load, so they're all often depending on parents, friends, family to help out with childcare. And during COVID, obviously, many single parents didn't have access to that. So it became increasingly evident that caregiving status and support availability is much more important than just gender in determining who loses the most ground in employment. So for example, single fathers, other men caregivers, transgender single parents, especially those with lower levels of income, education, and precarious employment, bore significant social and economic burdens during COVID-19, often much more so than partnered women and children did. But they were nowhere to be found in the mainstream discourse about gender and caregiving during COVID. Finally, I think it's really crucial to make remote and flexible work hours available at all levels of employment, including executive and management positions. In present practice, employers that offer workers the option of working remotely often end up creating a two-tier system in terms of pay and in terms of career advancement, with those who choose remote and flexible work still predominantly, although not exclusively women, experiencing lower wages and slower career advancement rates. We're seeing very clear evidence of this now, much clearer evidence than we had back then. So for remote work to be effective as a means for reducing career advancement gaps, we need a redefinition of who an ideal employee is based on performance in measurable terms over presenteeism, which is the number of hours spent in the workforce. That is also necessary. And I think you all know what I mean, right? You see some people, you don't see them very often. You know they're enormously productive at their job, at least in academia. On the other hand, I see some people and it's either like water cooler, coffee, I don't know, grad lounge, and you think, okay, I'm not sure how much work this person actually gets done. They're always here though, right? So I think we need to figure out a way of rewarding performance over presenteeism. And the thing is, this will benefit all employees since balancing work and family responsibilities are emerging as concerns for all workers, irrespective of gender identity. I did a study a few years ago before COVID, and we found that for Canadians below the age of 35, there was no difference. Nobody wanted, in the future wants to work all the time, basically. Everybody wants time with family, with their kids, and there was absolutely no gender difference in our findings. So it means that this can help everyone in the future. So moving on to the care sector and the care economy in Canada, COVID-19 probably provided the strongest impetus in decades for a national childcare strategy. In September 2020, Justin Trudeau, federal government, made a big promise in the throne speech. They said it was for the creation of a national childcare strategy, and it was a response to the fact that women had been much harder hit than men by the job losses during COVID. I mean, of course, advocates have been calling for an accessible childcare system dating back to late 60s, 1970, I believe, when the Royal Commission on the Status of Women recommended a national childcare policy. The difference in 2020 was that it wasn't just feminists and childcare advocates who asked. The call for affordable childcare was echoed by other groups, Chamber of Commerce, the Bank of Canada, and all major banks in Canada, actually, after the pandemic made it very clear that not fixing this problem would have widespread economic implications. And today, the Canada-wide Affordable Early Learning and Childcare Program has reached all 10 provinces and 3 territories. Yes, sometimes access remains uneven. There are long wait lists in some provinces and territories, but there is still cautious optimism that a childcare system that is affordable and accessible for all families across Canada is possible. So in addition to childcare, COVID provided unprecedented impetus for strengthening long-term investment in other important areas of the care sector, including caring for seniors and adults with special needs. The senior care crisis in Canada, of course, became only too obvious if you remember during COVID, the thousands of nursing home deaths during COVID. I think for 2020, in fact, it was 17,000 when I looked for 2020 and 2021. Proportionate to its population, the number of elders in Canada in institutional care is one of the highest in the world. But not much attention has been paid to home care and supportive housing as strategies that would enable elders to continue living and aging at home. Within Canada, I would say Quebec had the best domestic example to emulate in terms of supporting personal support workers, and particularly home care. They hired 10,000 personal support workers and doubled their wages, which is also really important because if you remember, a lot of this was happening because people were working in 3 different places because they're paid so poorly. Right. So that was a big piece. I think Canada can also look to Denmark, for example, the Netherlands, for an example of a society that keeps people living at home through a very strong supportive housing system. With the COVID pandemic highlighting this type of the systemic neglect towards Canada's elders, a national elder care strategy, today it seems imminent. Now, the other point that is in terms of care economy, sorry about that. So yes, a lot of attention to long-term investment. Proponents of degrowth have also emphasized that while energy and resource-intensive sectors of the global economy need to shrink in the future, other critical democratic infrastructures, such as the infrastructures of care, must expand and flourish. So the COVID pandemic has demonstrated not just the need for a structural reform of the care sector, but the fact that employment in the care economy, so childhood education, primary education, social work, health, library services, often fields that are highly feminized, you have a lot of way more women working in them. These fields are already green and sustainable in ways that employment that relies on extractive energy-intensive sectors are not. The care industry, for example, is 30% less polluting in terms of greenhouse gas emissions than the construction industry. Education industry is 62% less polluting than the construction industry. So if you think about it that way, you can create 2.7 times as many jobs, for example, by investing the same amounts of money in the care economy rather than construction. Caring work should be, therefore, a cornerstone of a clean and green post-COVID economy. That's the other part of my research. So I look at access issues in the transition to renewable energy. So when I ask most people, what do you think is a green job? It's always things like installing solar panels, manufacturing wind turbines, or planting trees, right? And definitely, right, these jobs do help us take better care of the planet. But caring for people is inherently green work, and it's also inherently green work. We need to rebalance our economy away from energy-intensive sectors focused on producing things for us to consume, more planned obsolescence, and towards labor-intensive sectors that actually help secure well-being for all. Of course, care jobs should also be made greener. There's no question about it. We should make, that should be a concern for all sectors, but investing in many more care jobs would address the care crisis. It would also offer people meaningful opportunities for work for people who moving out of industries that need to shrink, as examples, retail and aviation. Of course, we do also need more jobs in renewable energy and energy efficiency, right? And things like low carbon infrastructure. And these jobs must also be accessible to all. So it's just that I think the definition of a green job should be broadened. And it should definitely include fields like healthcare and education. Creating many more jobs in these sectors and improving wages and working conditions, that's where the valorization part comes. It's not just about paying people more, it's about respecting different occupations. That would address, it would help with gender inequality in these sectors. And it would also lead to better outcomes for everyone by making sure that we are better cared for and educated. It would provide opportunities for workers while leaving precarious work elsewhere and industries that need to either shrink or they need to wind down altogether because of their climate impact. So I'm getting up towards my conclusion. Although COVID-19 led temporarily to a downscaling of production, transport, and emissions, as recommended by degrowth proponents, it's very important to emphasize that this doesn't represent degrowth. A degrowth transformation must be planned, it must be democratic, and unlike the temporary and short-term changes triggered by an economic recession, degrowth also requires a permanent long-term commitment to the downscaling of production and consumption, as well as the reorganization of society in a much more just way. COVID-19 disproportionately affected the poorest and most vulnerable in society, whereas a degrowth transformation, a planned one, would be intentional and proactively pursued and have redistributive justice and equality at its core. Having said all of this, it's important to acknowledge that Canada appears to be mostly resuming its pre-pandemic growth trajectory. Air travel has returned to pre-COVID levels, of course. The CERB has long been discontinued, although I do think that UBI is much more in the public domain than it's been before COVID. We hear conversations still. And employers are increasingly insisting on a return to in-office work. Although, again, post-COVID, many employers are now incorporating remote and flexible work possibilities into their longer-term recruitment and retention strategies. So now when you look at jobs, very clearly it says, hybrid, 2 days in office, and they're using that very specifically to attract different groups of workers and saying, it's become a retention and a recruitment strategy. So whether the policy lessons that COVID-19 inadvertently provided about how an intentional degrowth strategy might be implemented in Canada are carried into the future, it's a matter of conjecture and it remains to be seen. But Canada's current climate plan, which is the Pan-Canadian Framework for Clean Growth and Climate Change, basically endorses economic growth and technological fixes as adequate solutions for the climate crisis, though it's becoming increasingly clear that technological changes such as transitioning to clean energy will not be enough to prevent climate breakdown. So degrowth then is a particularly important strategy for Canada to consider, that since the average Canadian produces 22 tons of greenhouse gases per year, this makes Canada the highest per capita GHG, it's a coal country, get that, among the G20 countries. And G20 as a whole is responsible for 80% of the world's GHG emissions. And yet degrowth has had very little mainstream influence in Canada. As a policy framework, degrowth has had very little purchase beyond activist and academic circles, largely because politicians don't win elections on promises to shrink the economy and scale back consumption, right? So I do believe there are now politicians who actually want to talk about degrowth, but the problem is they also don't want to scare the horses, right? So they want to have this conversation in a way that doesn't scare the horses. So maybe that's something we need to work on as well. If you look at Canada, even the two most socially and environmentally progressive parties in Canada, so the NDP and the Green Party, they envision a future based on green growth and some limited economic redistribution delivered via income support and expansion of health and social protection infrastructure. Definitely not degrowth. I've never heard that word used once by a politician. The mainstream discourse about degrowth, definitely doesn't help matters at all. So, for example, you can read that one. Let's debunk the new Marxist degrowth craze. It's so what? I can't actually see from here. It's a one-word plan to destroy the world economy. And this one, I'll leave it with you. You can read it. It was in the National Post, and I thought this is kind of, RIP because Rex Murphy died earlier this year. But it was kind of, I was reading it and thinking, this is kind of more like hard punditry. It's not really what degrowth is, right? So, and also there's also climate denialism in it. So I just thought, wow, this is what makes this sometimes really hard. And the Financial Post one actually cracked me up because it said it's a 4-minute read. Thinking maybe you need a little bit more time. So the existing scientific evidence suggests that to remain within the 2 degrees Celsius threshold, which was agreed upon by the Paris Climate Accord. Initially, though, the goal was 1.5, agreed on 2%. To do that, Canada must leave 75% of all coal reserves, 74% of oil reserves, and 24% of gas reserves undeveloped and underground. This would require a massive transformation of the Canadian economy and society. Yet, Canada's current commitments put forward as a part of the Paris Climate Accord puts the country on track to actually have 5 degrees Celsius of warming by the year 2100. None of us in this room will be around, but my son was born in 2010, so he'd be 90 that year. So he'd be around. So these very alarming projections suggest that the concept of degrowth must mobilize politics, policies, and alternative visions of reconciling economic security, environmental protection, and social justice that have much more broad-based public support in Canada. In other words, well beyond the academic, NGO, and activist circles in which the degrowth conversation has presently gained traction. Thank you so much.
Thank you, that was fantastic. We have a lot of time for questions.
Yeah, wow. I will.
Just raise your hand, I'll come around with the microphone. We need this just because as you saw, we're taping, the voices when you're facing this way won't project to the microphones that way. So, I saw Bill. Let's start here and I'll come this way.
Hello, thank you for the talk. It was really great. I learned a lot. I can't help but think degrowth having to go hand in hand with demilitarization. And I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts about that with the increasing push for Canada to reach NATO's 2% spending expectation. And so is there any way to reconcile these two goals? And I feel like with the conflict in Ukraine and our support of Ukraine, it's an impossible conversation to almost have, politically and otherwise. So you can just speak to that a bit.
I'm gonna agree with you, right? Like that, sometimes the terminology for green has been co-opted so badly that I'll hear things about green war. I actually read stuff about green war, right? So you kind of think about it, it's kind of breathtaking, really, right? How things can be co-opted. One of the reasons I like degrowth, honestly, I'm fully agreeing with you. Sandra was my PhD student, by the way. She worked on militarization and gender equality. So yeah, good question. Of course, I agree with you. But yeah, like I don't even know where to begin in that sense, right? Of course, we must demilitarize, but how to do that? Especially right now, I really don't know like a perfect answer for you. All I can say is I like the idea of degrowth also because it's very hard to put a spin on it. Like it's hard to, for capitalism to say you know what I mean? Like it is radical to begin with, right? Unlike terms like sustainability or green growth. So I do like that, but yeah, that's I think another research project. Think about how to demilitarize alongside green growth.
My question was more of a beginning, Deb, you opened up and talked about, we've exceeded, I think it was 5 out of 7
Planetary boundaries, basically.
boundaries for habitable
Yeah.
planet.
Yeah.
And could you explain what those are? I know, we all know that there are all kinds of ways we're endangering the. But I didn't know about the boundaries, and the idea that we've already exceeded that is very, and I think it is relevant to the really interesting rest of the stuff we want to do, because it really pushes the motivation for it beyond what I had thought existed.
There are different ways of measuring, there's a whole, now, like in ecology, you have the ecological footprint, you have different various ways of looking at planetary limits. And I think the one is basically we're in stage 4 of the 9 of what makes a habitable, a planet. And there are what are specific metrics about what air quality should be like, what, forest regeneration is like, so things like that. And the other one that's used is called Earth overshoot. So in the sense that, the Earth's ability to regenerate and what we take from it, like when does that happen in any given year, right? So in the past, the date would be like December 29th, okay, we reach, okay, fine, we're still within limits, 2 days we exceed. Last year, Earth overshoot day was in May, I think. So by May every year, we consume far more than the planet can regenerate. So there's a whole, our courses taught on how to do this. So that's what I meant by.
Could you give a reference for the
Earth overshoot day?
No, not just, well, okay, but for what the barriers are.
Sorry.
What the planetary boundaries?
The planetary boundaries.
Oh, the planetary boundaries? That's a course in and of itself. So there are lots of things in that. Primarily, some of it is looking at carbon emissions, right? Because we know the big problem with carbon emissions is that they have a very long half-life, carbon does, right? So it's one thing, even if we were to reach net zero today, which is impossible, right? Or in 2030, we still have to talk about mitigations for a long time because of all the carbon we've already pumped.
Yeah.
So that's basically how it's,
Well, was there a particular work that those levels came from?
a particular work to reference.
Yes.
I can't think of it right now, but yes.
That would be really, okay.
Maybe to the Stockholm region,
There is.
research in Thai,
Sorry?
Um,
Oh, you have a reference.
this Stockholm, I will not really, my Wi-Fi is not working,
Okay.
so I cannot open it, but
Well, we all want to get these references.
you can find it online.
I'll share it with you for sure. There are quite a few tools actually.
Okay.
Yeah. For mention.
Well, thank you. So you'll send it, but
I will.
I'll make sure you.
Send me a note.
Okay.
Thank you. I have a question about a little more recently how we were applying to Canada, specifically thinking about kind of looking into also your future work, like work that you do and everything, and I'm dipping into that a little bit. Sure, but I am wondering, especially with like the discourse, but also the very real reality, at least in Canada, where just like both job vacancies are there, and then at the same time, like people there's not enough like jobs are. It's a really kind of interesting space that we're found that we're finding ourselves in terms of influencer trends. What would you see, and like what kinds of solutions for that very particular but really convoluted context could Degrowth offer?
I mean, I teach a course on Degrowth work, which we also talk about degrowth. It's hard to have a simple answer to that, but generally, I think what's happening is just moving away from what, like, first of all, what a good life is. And like I said, right, many of these, what is a good life, right? Like to ask ourselves that and to think of how to simplify that life. No, degrowth isn't about us going and living in caves and eating beans for the rest of our lives or whatever, right? So I think that there is fundamentally also the idea of work, because we're so defined by it. And that is changing now for, I think, younger generations especially. It's not a bad thing in that sense. And there is a lot of work to be done, which is why I think the care sector is a really good example of, when we look today in Canada in the future, do you know what the fastest growing job is over the next like 30 years? Personal support worker, right? We'll all be, I was like, oh, that 30 or 40 years for sure. So that's kind of it, right? So I think there is a lot of work to be had if you look at like aging, you know, baby boomers, Generation X, all that. And it's just about making those jobs desirable as well. That's why we have this situation now where we have jobs that nobody, jobs, but nobody gets them. And then other times people are saying, well, like that's why we have high unemployment. We have jobs that nobody's filling. It's like when I lived in Los Angeles, we used to say it's a city of houses with no people, empty, completely empty. You never see people living there, huge mansions up. And then like people with no homes. Like that's what it kind of looks like.
Thanks, Chaplain. So this is a little bit outside of what we talked about, but I really want to ask you about the housing crisis that we have in Canada and how you think about that in terms of the equipment model, because people need homes. There's a housing crisis, and I know that the building organizations are very resistant to kind of build things with multi-generational homes. So, and it strikes me that a multi-generational home could really address a number of the different things that you talked about in your talk, like the long-term care and care of elderly and that kind of work, but also support for, working parents, and so forth. So I just really want to get your thoughts on that, and if you dug into that at all.
You kind of already, like, in a sense, answered the question. I was going to say that different ways of living, right? Like, in that sense, I remember the beginning of COVID when people were forming those bubbles kind of a thing, right? And there would be these stories in the CBC that saying, wow, and these families, very, increasingly among the South Asian population, people are living, moving in with their parents and living intergenerationally. That's how most of the world lives, actually, So it was always reported very breathlessly as if this is something really new, when it isn't, right? So, and also, like, that is just one model, I think, and you're right. So the ideas of, for example, different ideas about how we care for parents, care for children, like so much of that would be better if we did go back to living in, more intergenerational homes, in closer to one another in communities. So yeah, all of that, in a sense, you already answered my question, I think. Yeah, and it doesn't mean that homes don't have to be built. Of course they do, right? But so much of our infrastructure could also be retrofit to be houses. Like, just look at commercial property right now as an example, right? Like, look at London. I believe it's the highest vacancy right now in Canada of commercial property. I mean, how much of that, if we did things differently, could be used quite effectively? And social policy helps as well. So the one that I often think of is Singapore, where they have this, I don't know if anyone knows about this, but in Singapore, well, basically, Asian families can tend to live intergenerationally in the past, but when Singapore, is not that, old a country, when it was kind of designed in a sense, it was apartments. People were going to live in apartments. They built apartment buildings where it's hard to live intergenerationally if you live in an apartment. So one of the things they did was, and they know that parents want to live close to their children. So now in Singapore, if you buy an apartment in the same building as a parent, a grandchild, like a family member, they give you a discount. Like they give you, it's very smart social policy because it also respects what traditionally people have done for one another, is looked after the family. So yeah, so I think a lot of smart, social policy could be used as well. Yeah.
So my question is mostly about.
Could you speak up a little bit or speak into the mic?
Sorry, I'm sleep around exams. But my question is basically, how do we bridge the point from activism to actually getting policy passed when we're at a point where even the most, I would say out of the three biggest parties in Canada, even the most progressive one, the NDP, is now against the carbon tax.
Mhm.
So if we're at that point, how do we convince the median voter to go for something that's named degrowth? Just like when somebody who doesn't know about the topic hears degrowth, they immediately assume the worst, right?
Of course, yeah.
So what do we do about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, one of it's a contradiction. Like it is a challenge because one of the things that like last year the Degrowth conference, the international conference, the keynote speaker who was chair of the IPCC said, we need a different term for degrowth. But I kind of resist that because I think I like that it's radical. Like I like that it can't be co-opted. But on the other hand, like I said, that is the big challenge because people don't take the time to fully understand what is meant, right? We're not asking people to, we're saying people should live better. And we're not saying that, certain countries, their economies need to grow, right? So unfortunately, the rhetoric becomes also now you want people who earn like $1 a day to live on 50 cents. Not at all. In fact, we want them to earn 30 or 40 times as much, right? So that's the whole point, that scaling down of not just, I would say, we get that, even within industrialized countries, we get that, there is everything in between, right? You have very wealthy, very poor. Emerging economies, for example, I mean, you have some of the wealthiest people in the world now in developing countries, and then you have also, big pockets of poverty. So in that sense, I think it is going to have to be through things like taxation, for example, as well, to tax people, obviously, who are much, high earners. Corporate taxing, and that piece is really challenging, right? Because no corporation is going to say we're going to shrink our work like next.
And I think the biggest issue with taxation, and that's my field of interest. But in taxation, I think the biggest issue is that Canada already, our economy is like somewhat stagnant, and we're next to the States, which has incredibly low taxes for businesses. So if we try to tell businesses, hey, maybe you need to pay your fair share, businesses will just move to the States.
Of course.
So isn't it, I think like it has to be something global to really make a difference.
It does, and it also has to, people have to like get it, right? That they have to believe it and want it. So I think of this as kind of, I was invited to speak somewhere where, it was called big thinking or something. And I was like, oh, I'm trying to think big, right? Like you've asked me to think big. So it's like, I don't know all the nuts and bolts of how this can be done, but it's very obvious that we don't need like as much as we need, to live. So if we change that, then also the systems change, right? In that sense. So corporations, just think about right now, like just having some basic things, not even degrowth, all the policy prescriptions. Just think about right to repair, how important that is, because these days they're willing to give you a brand new anything, even if you break like a tiny piece of something, rather than help you repair it. Right. So just things like that, I think incrementally can be done. But I fully agree that this is fairly radical and the way people understand it. I mean, I sometimes even get student papers where people are saying, so you're basically saying poor people should be poor. So yeah, it is a struggle to explain it.
I just wanted to thank you because like I wasn't entirely sure about the name and the topic itself, that it makes a lot of sense now that I've actually can come and listen to you. So I wouldn't say it's like the goal is more like more equitable and sustainable rather than just shrinking the economy. That makes a lot more sense.
Absolutely, like the redistribution piece we get, but the point is, it's not also just about GHGs, right? About greenhouse gas emissions. Degrowth involves other material throughput as well. So think about how much right now the renewable energy thing. I mean, it's just like everywhere. You know, we want to talk about renewable energy. We should transition all of that. And because the goal is net zero, we don't seem to care about the mean. I mean, there are horrible practices in mining, for example, now for cadmium, lithium, cobalt, nickel, but we seem to not care about the means. We just care about the ends, right? So we have to have that conversation. And I like something based on where we can just keep consuming as we have is just not sustainable, right? So it's not enough. The green, whatever you want to call it, the green economy is not enough.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Baruah. So I was listening to a podcast this morning, and it's about degrowth, and it's saying that as a result from the Great Depression, we've become hoarders, and in Costco, we're buying in bulk, and we're buying all these things, and we're stocking up for like the inevitable what if. And we're saying that besides a place to sleep, eat, shower, relax, we're paying rent for a place to just put our things. And so we're spending all this money to just keep all these things that we're buying that we don't necessarily need. And I was wondering if you have any advice for how people like us, like me, should like practice degrowth, and if you could share maybe what you're doing to practice degrowth as well.
Well, I mean, on that, I'm the opposite of a hoarder. I give away things and then I think, well, I wanted that. Actually, might not want later. So in that sense, I mean, you're right? Like if in the US, actually, the storage industry is one of the biggest, fastest growing ones. Again, because 1 in 3 Americans move every year and puts all their stuff in storage that they're obviously never going to look at again sometimes, right? So it just requires a shifting, I think, of. And truthfully, I felt like COVID provided probably the best impetus, because if you remember, we all kind of simplified our lives and thought, this is actually not so bad. Like I remember thinking that, and I told myself things like, do I really have to go? Because I get invited to speak, a lot and, have to fly a lot for that. Like, do I have to go to these things? Can I reduce by half? So yeah, just making those kind of like small steps, and maybe I can do half online and I can do. So making those kinds of decisions, I think is really important.
What would you recommend maybe like Gen Z, youth, millennials, or like the younger generation to start practicing degrowth?
Yeah, big steps. All of that, like I said, right? Like just changing perspectives on what we want and what we need. I mean, most people can't even distinguish between those, right? And what you really need to be healthy and well, and focusing on other things. Like, I think the last one says, there's one that I like. I obviously like if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your economy. So that's a good one. But like less stuff and more relationships is vital, right? And that I think it's hard because capitalism doesn't encourage that. It's more stuff, less relationships, right? So shifting that concept is important.
And the same podcast I was listening to, I'm not sure if you've heard about this, but there's this phenomenon that apparently happens in Sweden when elderly people around the age of 60, they start decluttering and selling their things so that when they inevitably pass away, they're not passing that burden on to their children and their next of kin to like get rid of all of these things. I thought that was very interesting. I was wondering also what you think about communes. I feel like that's been like a topic of discussion recently, or instead of like living with a partner and like this nuclear family, that people are coming together, buying land together and sharing kind of, I guess, like local production and cooperation with the safety group.
I mean, absolutely. Like, I mean, you don't have to convince me of that, obviously. Like the whole intergenerational blend relationships, thinking of other ways of looking after one another. And it's also from a gender perspective, it's very interesting because I shared this data and people are often shocked. For example, if you look at in India, for example, very common to live intergenerationally, right? Women, if you ask them, they say, I've benefited so much. My career has benefited so much from living with family, right? Because then childcare is not, you can just, your parents are there to look after them. There's always someone in the family. Not often men, but it's another woman. I get that. So that hasn't changed. But still, they would say, what do you owe the fact that you have this incredible career and you can do this? And they'd be like, yeah, but I don't ever have to think about that. I remember going to conferences and meeting this woman who also has a PhD, works for this big think tank in India called the Energy and Resources Institute. And I said, hey, Minnie, how often do you travel, like for work? And she's like, yeah, I don't know, maybe I do like 10, 12 trips a year. I was like, our kids were the same age, right? So I said, and how does this, like, in terms of, how do you, basically how do you guys manage you and your husband? She's like, oh, my mom lives with us and sometimes his mom comes and lives with us. So she was very clear that that's what provides the support, right? So thinking about going back to living, I think, more intergenerationally, you definitely, it's also counterintuitive because it's really good for women's careers sometimes. People don't think about that, right? Because they're used to thinking of like living with your in-laws would be the worst thing on the planet, but it can also be incredibly empowering.
There's, I had a question, I don't know how to put it exactly. Part of the reason, this kind of was a theme throughout the talk, part of the reason that growth is so popular is it's associated with the creation of wealth. As if it were out nothing, but put that bit aside for a moment. I wonder if one way to frame this is, and some of these things you have up here speak to that, is the sort of recapture of wealth that already exists. Whether it's time or money or resources, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Do you mean redistribution or recapture?
I don't know what I mean. Just trying to think of what's the alternative to wealth creation in this story.
To me, it's kind of redistribution, right? Like that's kind of the big piece and the big challenge because I think, again, like not to quote Gandhi, but hey, I'm Indian, it's okay. The planet does have enough for everyone's needs, right? But definitely not for everyone's wants. And that is the big piece that we are like, we have people who haven't met their very basic needs. There are people around the world. And yet there's like the accumulation is so intense and it's so entrenched in our culture that, that's part of the problem. And actually to the question, different one, about carbon and, like carbon trading, for example, I'm not super, and like, I'll tell you why, right? Because to me, it seems like it's another way of commercializing the environment and of creating speculation and possibilities for accumulation, capital accumulation, right? The timeline makes me also very anxious because if you remember, carbon trading really got its boost during the last recession. Some of us are old enough to remember it, like the 2008. Remember that? So it was almost as if at that time, global capital said, well, wait. This real estate has crashed. Stocks and bonds, like investments have crashed. So what can we now commercialize? Right. So the environment became a very, there it is. We're all talking about this. So I don't think it actually helps mitigate at all either, because all it does is transfers the responsibility to mitigate, which we need to do, and particularly people who have more than enough, right? Particularly the wealthy. We just transfer it to a poor and less powerful entity. So you can continue polluting, but you're going to go and plant a whole bunch of trees in Indonesia. You know what I mean? And now it's so interesting when I go to energy conferences, they're talking the same talk. It's so corporate, that whole culture now of carbon trading. So I don't think, we can't solve the problems of the world, with the problems that created them, right? We have to shift away from them. And that's kind of, I think, what I would say. And it's a very difficult, it's very difficult to move for sure.
So, following up on the latter part of your response here, you can certainly see the dangers in monetizing the but isn't there a promise to doing that as well, in which you give an honest accounting of what the costs of any kind of production actually is? You can. Unfortunately, from a social justice perspective, I've thought about that. A lot of people think of that as if you give something a price, it raises its price, not necessarily its value, though. Do you know what I mean? It just raises the price. So I have a lot of thoughts about it, but nothing that is very clearly formulated. Because I also think if we do that, if we all become economic units, right? It's always going to be super unfair because there are always going to be people who are going to be more valuable to the system, right? I think of it that way. Then we would always place, also in terms of nature, then you have
we place more value on pandas because they're cute and you see them in everything, right? Whereas insects are going extinct by the minute, in the time we've been sitting here and we never pay attention to it. So that's why I worry a bit about monetizing the environment again.
So how do you think, what is the reason? Do you have anything, any thoughts about the relationship between liberal and immigration policy?
Oh boy.
Yeah, so. But sometimes I feel it's a very contradictory when we talk about economy and immigrants that often work in that area. But why we have this affordable rent for childcare? At the same time, for example, in Ontario, we pay very poorly for childcare workers. And also we don't in Ontario, we don't have any provincial program for them to become PR. So that's why now childcare center in Ontario is closing because the childcare workers after they work here 1 or 2 years, they need to move to another province. And meanwhile, like the waiting list very long, children cannot get in, and like many register for childcare before she was born. She needs to wait until 2 years old to get in, and centers closing and workers go out. And that's because of immigrant relation policy. And also now, from this year, like Canada, from last year, Canada started to tighten the for international students as well. Like only five areas can stay here to work. Like that only agriculture, technology, healthcare, transportation, and trade. Only 5 areas, and that's not including many things like private childcare. So, and but on the other hand, like
Maybe you'll go for a response.
on the other hand, like keeping inflation low, then what can be a big growth is going to be a bit, but at the same time it can harm the economy. But do you have any thought about that?
Washroom will be both in 15.
First of all, okay, migration is being used as a strategy in the climate conversation. You know that, right? So there are people that are like, oh, well, the Mauritius, where is Mauritius going to go? And sometimes I see these interesting things. Like I remember I saw one where they actually came out of Colombia, I think in the US, where they talked about who are the biggest polluters and then who should have to accept climate migrants. So do you know what I mean? So it's like, okay, so let's assume that let's assume a number of 100. So it's going to be like, that's what this pool of 100 are the people who have to move because of climate-related reasons. How many does the US have to take based on what the emissions are like, right? So I looked at that, okay, it's interesting, and it is being used like in many places, but you can't. There's much more to like people need somewhere to move. They don't want to move. People want to live where they are, right? So that's a real that piece is really important. Sometimes I'll even see things like, well, indigenous people or like people in northern Canada, well, they can move. Like they can move to as if that's a solution to like dealing with climate issues. But so my point being, it's good and it's being used as well, right? Unfortunately, I always feel that migration sometimes is used. We'll allow certain groups of people in and certain not. You're obviously very clear about that already, right? They're going to have to. Canada, for example, has to accept people who are personal support workers. We don't have enough. There's going to be a huge category, right? So paying them well, that piece is really, really important. But more broadly, I feel that in the climate migration debate, it's kind of interesting because we first talked about mitigation, right? We all have to mitigate. That's the most important piece. We have to reduce, carbon emissions, for example. Then slowly the conversation shifted from mitigation, and we started hearing terms like adaptation and resilience. Yeah. And I get it. I get that we have to adapt and be resilient because, like I said, the carbon's already out there, a lot of it, right? So even if we go to net zero, we still have to, mitigate. We'll still be dealing with. But then we start talking about migration within that as well. Well, maybe people can move, and go to other countries. I always worry about it because the vast majority of the world's climate migrants are not going to North America and Europe. They're being absorbed within their own countries, or at most like the neighboring countries, right? So that's kind of one piece. And also when migration is used as a strategy for the climate debate, right? Often it's like the migrant has to be perfect. it has to be a desirable migrant. They have to go earn money, send money home, you know. So it's very, in that sense, what if you're not a desirable? What if you get sick and you actually need to claim, you need welfare basically in that country? So I think it's a kind of a dangerous, in that sense. So, but definitely it's being used a lot. Like, but it's always the adaptive, resilient migrant. That's what everyone wants.
Thank you, Bipasha, for the lecture and the response to some of the questions that have already been asked. One is that I have a comment and a question. My comment, as we talk about degrowth in this part of the world, I'm just thinking about the larger implications for global South countries or African countries that have in the past in camping sites for these parts of the world. So if we are saying that do not keep a lot of property, or do not keep a lot of things that you don't want, at the end of the day, there's going to be a jump generated from this part. And the rationale or the morality behind not wasting is intended to a less privileged part of the world that will benefit from the first. But we also know that a lot of the things that are shipped down that supposedly are helpful, that supposed to not benefit the people of the global south, or in this case, African continent, end up being trash and end up polluting the environment.
Yeah.
Right? Causing the ripple effects of to the environment and climate change and all that. So I still am thinking, I'm like, okay, this is the white people's problem. When I say white people's problem is not a developing country's problem. So what will that implication be for countries that are yet to grow and the agenda being preached or being taken on by most of the governments and the presidents over there? Let's also go, let's do all the wrong things that this part of the world has done to grow, to get there. So there's this larger disparity and inequality you see on both sides that I guess then I'm thinking of like, okay, what does what are the implications for developing countries? Maybe we cannot resolve everything today, but that's one.
Yeah, actually one piece, I mean, nowhere in degrowth is it like we're going to produce the junk and shift it. We're going to not produce that to begin with, right? That's kind of what it's supposed to be, that we need. And many developing countries need to grow. There's no question their economies need to grow. So that's the point, that it's about right sizing where everybody is able to meet their needs well, but nobody has that much accumulation. You know what I mean? Like capital accumulation. So that's kind of the point for developing countries. Having said that, I totally agree with you, because often, you go to like the COP meetings, right? Like the Conference of Parties, and you hear, for example, I'm not even talking about smaller countries I'm not talking about like Burkina Faso, I'm not talking about like, Mali, I'm not talking about smaller countries that do generally need to grow, like Sierra Leone. The emerging economies are a real issue, like India and China will always go to COP and say, we have every right, to grow our economies. And I'm like, well, you do, but it's a very unequal country to begin with, right? So there are many people who don't actually need it's more about, it's a distribution problem. It's not a problem of wealth. So I think it's also kind of, when your kids, your parents say, if your friends jump off a bridge, are you going to go and jump off, right? Like, no, right? That's what it feels like when I hear some emerging economies, developing countries say, well, you did it, you polluted, so now this is our turn. Let's envision different ways of developing in the future, you know what I mean? And particularly it bothers me when I hear like India, China making those arguments, because I was like, no, that's really easy, that needs to be called out, because it's not racist to say, like that India and China really also need to think about how we're going to move ahead with this, right? So that's kind of my point, that yes, they need to grow, but they can grow in it doesn't have to be the same model that brought us here to begin with, right? To this crisis to the West. So it can be a different model.
So now my question is, so let's say Canada buys into the group, what would be the future like for Canadian or Canada? What would be the future of the group for Canada? We buy Canada.
For us, I mean, I don't think truthfully, for most middle class and, not much. In fact, actually, I think you could live better. That's the point, right? And for people who are actually, who need more resources, they should have more. That's the whole point, right? So it's about creating a more equitable society. It's not about asking people to starve themselves or to deprive themselves of everything. So it's like, that's kind of it.
You have time for one more? There's
So many questions, why?
Okay, I'll ask one. This one is important. What will life give? Yes.
Yeah, I know.
Let me ask a smaller question, which is, so I like this useful production very much. It's clearly not the way our economy is organized. How do we get from where we are, which is opportunistic production and the creation of demand, to a place where we're doing useful production and not just profit extraction?
I mean, I don't have the whole piece for you, starting with just planned obsolescence, right? Like, just think of it. You go buy anything, a cell phone, whatever, an iPad, you don't even bring it home. It's already out of date and it'll be a new one, right? And it's completely designed to be that way. Like, you notice your iPads, like the charger doesn't work when you get, as soon as you need a whole new system of stuff, right? So that, I think, we need to say we won't take it anymore, basically. We don't want that anymore. And we want things that are built to last, for example. Like Europe is now starting that very much, where you have to, policy to actually prevent planned obsolescence. Or at least not entirely, but it's like, okay, you can't come up with a new model just because you can within the next 2 years. Right? So it'll have to be small steps like that. But I mean, I completely get it. I have so I think last year, I have a food processor, and once just the lid fell on the ground and a tiny little piece of plastic broke off. So I called and I said to the company, I just need to replace the lid. And they said, yeah, we'll send you a new unit. And I thought they were sending a new lid, right? So I said, well, you'll send me a new lid, you have them? Like, no, it's just as well, we can send you the whole unit, basically, we can replace it. I said, I don't want that. I literally want a lid. Give me a lid. And I literally had to pick that fight with them, to actually get a lid. I'm basically saying, no, I don't want a new blender. Yeah. So, yeah. So we need policies that make repair cheaper that's a big one, than buying new products. Yeah.
Okay, I think on the no new dongles for you. Might be a good place to stop. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming again. There's another coming next Thursday, same time, same place. Probably healthy talking, promising.